experience as a teenager of being part of a group of young progressive evangelical Christians in the late 60s, and coming to read theology, and then coming to read moral theology, and then thinking, these guys keep talking about, Kant and these other philosophers, so maybe I should read that. I was also dealing with coming to terms with my sexual orientation and wanting a framework that wasn't the framework of a kind of moral teaching that just told you what was right and wrong but didn't say why. And I wanted to think about why things might be right and wrong in order to decide whether certain things were actually right or wrong. But then, as a profession, so that's why I started reading philosophy, really. And then, including moral philosophy, though I didn't just read moral philosophy, I was reading all kinds of philosophy. And then another big impetus was when I finished my PhD, which was not about social and political philosophy, it was about philosophy of language. I got a job, my first job, as assistant professor of African American and African Studies in philosophy, and I wanted to teach something in the second half of the job, the African and African American part of the job, that was useful to that program. And it seemed to me that there were two things that were useful. One of them wasn't social and political philosophy, it was just a sort of philosophy of social science and philosophy of biology about the race concept, but the other was ethics, racism, trying to understand what racism is, what's wrong about it, and so on. And so in order to do that, having not done a lot of work in graduate school, or even as an undergraduate really, in formal ethics, I had to read up on formal ethics and political philosophy and social philosophy in order to do that. So sort of two stages. One is just getting interested in philosophy, which had a lot to do with my sense of who I was, both as a young Christian and as a gay person. And then when I came to my first job, I needed something to do, as it were, in that part of the job, and that seemed like, and then I just got interested, and then I was stuck. Well, it wasn't when I started out. I mean, there wasn't a lot of stuff, and that was part of the reason it was interesting to me, was because it's nice to work in fields where there's just lots of low-hanging fruit, as it were. So I started on work on philosophy of race, which is a genre of identity, because I was in this department and it seemed like a useful thing to do, and there wasn't very much. There's lots of sociology, lots of anthropology, lots of work, relevant work in biology, but not much in philosophy at that point. So that was great, because, as I say, you could just start thinking philosophically about something. There's material to work with, but there wasn't a lot of work by philosophers, so you could sort of, make progress pretty swiftly on race and racism. And then it's natural for a philosopher who's interested in race to think, well, race, because philosophers generalize, race is a species of something. What's it a species of? Well, it's a species of the genus identity. And that was a particularly good time to start thinking about that, because feminist philosophy was really taking off and had done a lot of work on gender as a form of identity. So bringing together my own work on race, which was obviously influenced by the work on gender, because that was the one place where there was some decent stuff to work with the work on gender, you get a more generalized notion. And then, when I started thinking about, well, why do these things matter? It struck me that actually identity is a central topic in ethics. We live our lives, ethics in Aristotle's sense of the study of what it is to live well for a human being, the good life, eudaimonia. And identity is central to that, because we live our lives as Ghanaians, Americans, gay people, straight people, cis people, trans people. And what does that mean? Well, that's what the ethics of identity is about. And I wrote a book called The Ethics of Identity that was about how identity fits into ethical life. And again, that was a somewhat neglected topic. People have thought about, as it were, our identity as rational beings. That's central to Kant's ethics. But the idea that our social identities, not the ones we all share, but the ones that divide us, are also important in ethics. It's obviously there in the political philosophy, literature on nationalism and so on, but not in a generalized way, not thinking generally about how identity fits into ethical life. And so that's I don't mean to say there's nothing in the history of philosophy, of course that would be absurd, but it wasn't really a field, a subfield. And so it was, again, interesting and fun to try to define a field in a certain sense. So my first job, as I said, was at the University of Ghana, and their university education was a very rare and special and privileged. There were not a lot of opportunities to study anything. There were only 3 universities at that point in Ghana. These were people who often came from families where the very idea of a university was a strange one, and their families didn't really know, as it were, what they were doing. They knew that they were very lucky because they knew that people with university educations tended to be better off. But they couldn't go home to their families and say, "Oh, I decided to study philosophy," and the families would say, "Oh, yes, that's terrific." Far from it. So that was one thing. And then I taught a bit at Cambridge when I was a fellow of a college, and I wasn't teaching things in ethics, so the question of identity wasn't a topic. But of course, it was very clear to me there were only 3 non-white people in my college. Class was just an overwhelmingly determinative thing in people's lives and the people I taught. Even though the fact that I was not white shaped my contacts and my friendships a little bit, the real striking thing to me was class, and I still think that that's one of the great challenges of the universities in Britain and in the United States. It's a big challenge here, and I wrote a chapter about class in my last book, and universities play this incredible role in solidifying class systems, and we really ought to be more reflexive about it and more careful than we are. But when I came to the United States, the most important thing about me for most people was that I was not white, was I was black. So identities, different identities matter in different places. I'd say also that I was gay. I mean, I think students, again, the United States was behind Britain in terms of the decline in homophobia. So for some gay students, it was nice to have an openly gay faculty member. So my first books were just aimed at philosophers. They were called Assertion and Conditionals and For Truth in Semantics. Those are not the sort of books that people rush into bookshops and pull off the shelf because they think, oh, that looks interesting. But once I started writing both essays and articles and books that were addressed to a wider public, it became clear to me that you don't really control what people will do with your books. You can't, as it were, force them to read them in any particular way. So people took up things that I'd said in ways that surprised me and found them useful in ways that I wouldn't have predicted. And that's fine by me. I mean, reading a book is something of a commitment, and I think people should do with it whatever they want. And if they don't want to do with it what I would imagine they would do with it, I'm happy for them to do something else with it. So, a lot of what's interesting to me in these books is because I'm a philosopher, is kind of the technical structure of the ideas, but that isn't terribly interesting for most people. What's interesting is applying it, and so increasingly, but always from the beginning, really, when I was writing for the general reader, I told stories, I gave examples of a sort of practical sort, often from my own life or from novels I was reading or from history books. What I came to see was that there's a kind of understanding which comes from explaining a concept narratively by telling stories about how the concept works. That is different from the kind of understanding that philosophers characteristically seek to communicate, which is kind of conceptual understanding, propositional understanding, telling you truths, as it were. It's not that this isn't a way of understanding truths, it is, but it's a different way of understanding truths, and it's one that philosophers aren't, I would say, usually terrifically good at. So I had to learn how to do it. And maybe I'm lucky that my mother was a novelist, and so I grew up around someone who was good at it. But I'm pleased when people say the book was useful. Then they tell me what they did with it, and sometimes I think, that's very interesting. I would never have thought of doing that. And that's fine. If I'm taken to have said something that I really didn't think I said, then I write another book or another article to try and get clearer what I was trying to say. And also, I write on the same topic sometimes because I've learned from the response that I got to the last time I were around, that I either didn't understand something and that my readers have helped me to understand it better, or didn't communicate something, and I tried to sort of restate the thing in a way that I think is more likely to be taken up correctly. But you can't rule out misunderstanding, and creative misunderstanding is one of the ways that intellectual progress happens. So I'm perfectly happy to be misunderstood sometimes. So let's take something in The Lies That Bind, which is a book about identity that I wrote recently, relatively recently. Everything I have to say in that book about the role of nationalism in people's political and psychological and cultural lives could have been stated in propositions. I could have just said, national identities operate to bring people together so that they can together run societies and do their politics and things like that. I could have said things like that. The way I did do it was to tell the story of the way in which the development of the Italian nation affected the life of Italo Svevo, the great Italian novelist. And I think people get a better sense of the way in which national identities get a grip on you by telling the story of this guy who's born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and ends up an Italian. And not just an Italian, but one of the great Italian modernist novelists, even though he grew up speaking German. I think that tells you, you can draw many conclusions from that. One, of course, is about the sort of facticity of nations, the fact that Trieste is part of Italy, not part of Slovenia, or not part of Austria. It's all pretty contingent. Talking about how in the novel he expresses his love for his city, and that's part of his attachment to Italy and so on. I think those are things that are best told by telling a little bit of the story of the life of Italo Svevo. I could say, and it would be true, that the modern concept of race is shaped in the early 18th century in Europe. But I told that story by telling the story of a young boy who came from what's now Ghana to Germany in the early 18th century and ended up as the first possessor of an European PhD in philosophy by an African. In the course of his life, race is being made, the modern notion of race is being, and you can see it in the way his life goes. And one reason why at the end of his life he returns to Ghana, having lived all his late childhood and adult life as a German, was the rise of a kind of anti-black sentiment that made him more comfortable back in this place that he barely knew. And so, anyway, these stories communicate these abstract ideas, and they also, then you can make the abstract point, and people remember it because they remember Anton Wilhelm Amo. And so, in that way, telling his story is holding, it gives people an anchor, as it were, for their conceptual understanding of the points you're making. So I'm working on two things now. One is a book about the idea of religion, which I think is a very misunderstood notion. I was raised a theist, and as I mentioned earlier, I was an evangelical Christian as a child and a teenager. But I think, but perhaps because of that, I find religion deeply, deeply fascinating, and increasingly I've expanded my interest in religions other than the one that I grew up with. And the second project is a project on another idea that philosophers have recently begun to say a lot more about. But again, when I started doing this, it was a somewhat sparsely populated field, which is what work is, in the sense of a job, and how that fits into ethics. How do our jobs fit into who we are, what it is to live well, what it is for a society to function properly, the rise of robots and all of that. And these are very important practical questions in policy and sociology and economics. But the normative question, if you, as work changes, what does that mean for the possibilities of a good life? These sorts of questions are not just, they're very important sociological, economic issues, but there are also these normative questions about these ethical questions. How does work reconfigured in that way fit into a decent human life, a life worth living? So those are the things I'm beginning to think about. So it's ethics. I don't terribly like the term. It's applied ethics. I think all ethics is applied ethics, but it's thinking about some important aspect of our lives in terms of the question, how do we do this right? And one of the important points in this area, I think, is that one constraint on doing it right is recognizing that doing it right is very different for different people. People are different. And one of the dimensions of their difference, to stick to my old hobby horse, is identity. One thing that work used to provide was a kind of class identity, which was a positive and important thing. One of the things that my neighbor, my working class neighbor in college, had to worry about was being alienated from his working class family by becoming what he was going to become, a doctor, a middle class person with a different style of life from them. And of course they were worried about it too. They were worried about losing him in a certain way. And that sort of question. Now I don't think we should live in that kind of class society myself. So I'm against those sorts of divisions, but I'm not against the idea that you should take pride in what you do. And if what you do is produce things like cars or coal, I think you should be able to take pride in that. And if you can't, we should let machines do it.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.